I had barely taken off my coat when her voice cut through the hall. Sharp, mocking, dripping with contempt. She's outdated. What's she even doing here? This family needs new blood, not her old traditions. Her words carried, deliberately loud enough for me to hear, as her friends laughed from the dining room I built brick by brick. My portraits, the ones I commissioned decades ago, stared down at me, ignored, while she basked in the center of my table like a queen who had dethroned me. My daughter-in-law didn't bother to lower her voice. She wanted the sting to land. I smiled, the kind of smile that hides a blade. "It's all right, dear," I said softly. But in that moment I decided she would learn exactly how sharp age can be. When my son first brought her home, she was all charm wrapped in modesty. Her hands folded neatly on her lap, her voice soft enough to make you lean in, as if her words were too delicate to carry across the room. She laughed at his jokes, not too loud, never too eager. She called me Mama the second time we met, and I'll admit, it melted something in me. I wanted so badly to believe she was the one. After my husband passed, I carried the fear that no woman would ever be good enough for my boy, that marriage would pull him further from me. But she eased those fears. He seemed kind, eager, respectful. I opened every door to her. My home, my kitchen, my traditions. I handed her recipes written in my handwriting, the ones my own mother had taught me, trusting she would carry them on. I gave her the family heirloom necklace to wear on their wedding day, fastening the clasp myself, whispering, "Now you are truly part of us." And when they moved into the house next door, a home I helped them purchase, I thought I had secured a future where I wouldn't be alone. I imagined Sundays filled with laughter, grandchildren tugging at my skirts, my son leaning in the doorway with the same crooked smile his father once had. But sweetness can sour. And masks, no matter how convincing, always slip. It started with the smallest things. A roll of her eyes when I suggested a dish, a tight smile when I offered advice. Then it became sharper. Cancelled dinners with excuses too rehearsed, whispers that floated just out of reach, and my son's tone, different, clipped, echoing hers. What I didn't know then was that she wasn't just settling into the family. She was replacing me in it. It's strange how betrayal doesn't crash down all at once. It seeps, quiet and steady, like water finding its way through stone until the cracks can no longer be ignored. At first I thought I was imagining it. A misplaced photo frame in the hallway, the one of me holding my son at his college graduation. Gone, replaced with a new canvas portrait of her smiling in white lace. I searched the storage room for it, only to find the frame wrapped in newspaper, shoved in the corner behind a stack of shoe boxes. The next week, during Sunday dinner, I noticed the family recipes I'd handwritten, the ones I gave her with love, served to guests without my name attached. "This is my grandmother's dish," she said once, gesturing at the casserole. I opened my mouth to correct her, but my son's proud gaze toward his wife froze me in place. His pride wasn't in the food. It was in her. And then there were the whispers I overheard at the women's luncheon. My friends spoke cautiously, their words dipped in sympathy. "She's been telling people you're too tired to host these days. Did you know she's applied for a leadership role in the Heritage Council? She says she's modernizing the family's image. Isn't that your work?" Each sentence was another thread unraveling the fabric I had spent decades weaving. It wasn't about recipes or parties. It was about legacy. She wasn't content being a wife or even the matriarch in waiting. He wanted my place now while I still lived. The final blow came at the gala, an evening I had planned, sponsored, and supported for nearly 20 years. I arrived in my usual gown, expecting to be greeted as I always had been, with respect, with deference. Instead, I walked into whispers, smiles that were tight, polite, distant. And then I saw it. The event program, glossy, printed, distributed to every guest. On the first page, beneath the section labeled Chairwoman's Welcome, was not my name. It was hers. Her photograph, younger, glamorous, radiant. A caption beneath it, bringing fresh vision to tradition. I felt my heart hammer, but my hand stayed steady. I accepted champagne from a server and sipped, letting the bitterness sit on my tongue as I scanned the room. There she was, basking under chandeliers, shaking hands as if she were queen of the evening. My son at her side, chest puffed with pride as though she had conquered the world. And in a way she had. She hadn't stolen money or property. She had stolen me, my identity, my voice. My place in the story of this family. As I stood there beneath the glitter of the lights, the realization settled like a stone in my chest. If I did nothing, she would erase me completely. My name, my work, my history, all rewritten in her favor. And that was when the first ember of anger began to glow. Not loud, not fiery, quiet, controlled. Like a coal that waits, patient and enduring for the moment it is needed. The first real fracture came one evening in my own kitchen. I had stopped by to drop off a basket of fruit, something I'd always done for my son even as a boy. He was leaning against the counter, scrolling his phone, and when I placed the basket down, his eyes flicked toward it with a sigh I knew too well. "Mom, you don't have to keep doing this," he said, not unkind but with a weariness that startled me. "Doing what?" I asked, smiling to cover the sting. "Dropping in. Bringing things. You know, hovering." The word lodged in my chest. Hovering. I had spent my life orbiting his, not to control but to protect, to nurture. Now the word sounded like an accusation. Before I could answer, she breezed in, hair loose, perfume clouding the air. She slipped an arm through his and kissed his cheek, her eyes darting toward me with a glimmer I knew wasn't affection. "She means well," she said, her tone soft, almost pitying. "But it's important we build our own space. Don't you think?" My son nodded, distracted, but I saw it. The way her words settled in him, the way they became his thoughts before he even realized it. The evidence of her manipulation grew bolder after that. At a charity committee meeting, I overheard her dismissing my contributions, painting me as old-fashioned, out of touch. "We can't cling to outdated ideas just because she insists," she said, not realizing I was within earshot. The other women nodded politely, uncomfortable, but no one contradicted her. I returned home that night to find my son waiting at my door. His expression was conflicted, but his words were rehearsed. "Mom, maybe you should think about stepping back from all these roles. You've done enough. You deserve rest." The echo of her voice was unmistakable. He thought the idea was his own, but it was her hand moving his lips. And then there were the smaller humiliations, the 1,000 cuts that bled me in silence. At family dinners, she corrected me in front of guests, turning my misremembered dates or softened stories into mistakes. At church, she repositioned herself at the pew beside my son, leaving me a step behind. At the market, I overheard acquaintances congratulating her for the scholarship fund I had established decades ago. She had introduced it as her own initiative. Each time I held my tongue. Each time I smiled. But inside, I was cataloging everything. The arrogance, the manipulation, the way she chipped away at me with careful, deliberate strokes. The world saw her as ambitious, modern, a breath of fresh air. But I knew the truth. She was not building something new. She was taking what was already mine, brick by brick, and claiming it as her creation. And worst of all, she had turned my son into her unwitting accomplice. That night, sitting alone in my study, I looked at the wall of photographs, generations of faces, my husband's steady gaze, my own younger self with the fire of ambition still in her eyes. And for the first time I spoke aloud to the silence. "She thinks I am finished. She thinks she has replaced me." My reflection in the glass of a framed photo met my gaze. "But she doesn't understand. I am not finished. I am patient." And with that, the ember inside me flared brighter. Grief has a way of hollowing you out. For weeks, I carried it in silence, letting her words echo in my head, letting the humiliation bruise me like fingerprints left on the skin. It would have been easy to retreat, to shrink into the shadows she was already pushing me toward. That's what she expected, what everyone expected. But grief is only one face of loss. Anger is the other. And anger, when sharpened properly, is a blade. I stopped trying to explain myself. I stopped correcting her lies. What was the use? She thrived on being seen, on attention, on loud declarations that bent truth into her version of events. I would never beat her there. No, I chose silence. I chose invisibility. And invisibility, when wielded, is dangerous. I began to study. Not her. I already knew her weaknesses, her arrogance, her need for recognition. No, I studied the structures she leaned on. The councils, the committees, the social ladders she climbed so proudly. I had spent decades in those rooms, decades earning the kind of respect you can't fake with a smile or a new dress. She thought influence meant being seen. I knew better. Influence means knowing where the strings are tied, and who is holding them. I revisited old contracts, names in my address book, records that had collected dust in my filing cabinet. The scholarship fund she paraded around as her brainchild? It still bore my name on every legal paper. The Heritage Council seat she coveted? I had once chaired it, and though I'd stepped down, my signature was still etched into the charter. Even the gala she had stolen with her photograph. The accounts that funded it were linked to endowments I had created. Everywhere she tried to root herself, I realized my hand had already been there first. She was building her empire on foundations I had laid. And that meant those foundations could be pulled from under her. I called no friends. I shared nothing with my son. I confided in no one. Instead, I reached out to lawyers I trusted, accountants who still owed me favors, former committee chairs who still remembered who had once signed their checks. Piece by piece, I began to draw a map. A quiet, meticulous blueprint of every place she had planted her flag, and every leverage point that still belonged to me. The shift was not sudden. It was steady. A calmness came over me, the kind I hadn't felt in years. The humiliation, the hurt, the doubt, they burned away, leaving only clarity. She believed she had erased me, but she had only reminded me of who I was. I was not fragile. I was not finished. I was the foundation. And foundations do not crumble, they decide when to shake the ground. She relied on glitter and breathless introductions, on the visible applause of people who had never worked for anything they celebrated. If reputation was her currency, I would carefully devalue it. I started small and invisible. I paid visits not to confront, but to listen. Afternoon teas, committee meetups, garden club luncheons. I let her speak into the air and watched how it landed. I wrote notes, the old-fashioned kind, sent on paper with my careful looping script. Not to attack, but to remind the network of facts she had quietly rewritten. A letter here, a phone call there. To Mrs. Harrow, who had chaired the scholarship selection committee when I first founded the fund. I was wondering if you'd keep me informed about the new criteria? I have some archives that might be useful. To Mr. Caldwell, the archivist at the Heritage Council. Do you still have the minutes from 2009 and the signatures attached to the endowment? These were simple, innocuous requests. The kind that raised no alarms yet nudged memory like a warm finger along an old scar. People began to recall. An offhand comment from an old colleague. Isn't that the fund Mary created? Planted a seed. A board member, embarrassed by his own lapse, corrected a public post that had credited her with the scholarship's creation. Small reattributions spread like a chain reaction. One polite correction became another, then another. Her carefully curated narrative began to wobble. I also fed subtle truths into places she frequented. A well-timed anecdote at the luncheon about the night the original gala had been saved by a last-minute donor, whose name I mentioned, reminded people of the Genesis story, and who had told it first. A cousin who'd been sidestepped by her at a charity auction received a handwritten note from me. Remember when we used to laugh at the mistakes we made organizing this? Those were the years that built the program. The cousin, flattered and a little guilty, began to mention the old days to anyone who would listen. Her public smile began to crack. Invitations that once arrived like constellations slowly glimmered less bright. She found herself answering fewer texts, receiving fewer handshakes. People had always liked the shine. Once the shine looked like borrowed light, it dimmed. Most importantly, I seeded doubt. Not accusations, only reminders of history and truth. I let the background hum of reality make her new narrative noisy and uncertain. She never noticed the soft erosion. She was too busy polishing her reflection to see the subtle tarnish forming at the edges. While social corrosion softened her, I worked the bones of the institutions she tried to colonize. This was not about theft or melodrama. It was a matter of paper, precedent, and procedure, the very things she had assumed she understood but never truly mastered. I began with records. My files, long thought obsolete, were my arsenal. The scholarship trust had been updated over the years, but certain clauses were unchanged. Clauses that required donor review for any major alteration. The Heritage Council's charter still listed me as a consultative trustee whose consent was needed for executive reassignments. The gala's endowment had a clause I myself had insisted upon. Any change in directorship required a public notice period and a vote from the founding donors. I wrote quietly and calmly, invoking the provisions I had once authored. I submitted formal requests. A request to review the scholarship's minutes, a petition to convene the Heritage Charter Review Committee, an accounting demand for the gala endowment's allocation. Each document was procedural, dry, and utterly boring on the surface. The sort of bureaucracy that bore the weight of law because people did not read it closely until it mattered. She had never spent a night reading bylaws. She had used charm and speed instead. The account managers, the trustees, the council secretaries. Many were people who had worked with me for years and owed me more than a handshake. They called with deference not because I wielded threat, but because, in the ledger of favors and history, I had credit. They reopened files. They requested signatures. They asked for clarification of past minutes. Her appointments and promotions stalled beneath the weight of procedure. There was a quiet, particular pleasure when the first official phone call landed on my daughter-in-law's voicemail. A polite notification from the council administrator informing her that her proposed appointment would be postponed pending verification of the founding charter's clauses. Her voice, usually glossy and ready, fluttered on the recording as she left a composed, but now distinctly defensive reply. Then there were the donors. I called a few, discreetly, with the measured tone of someone who had shared long afternoons in boardrooms and had once sat across from them with cups of bad coffee and the same earnest dreams. I reminded them carefully of the origins of the scholarship, of the original intent, of the importance of safeguarding the fund for its listed purpose. I did not rail against her. I simply made sure those who still cared about legacies remembered what the legacy was. When the major donors requested an independent audit, I did not celebrate. I merely put on my gloves and watched. The audit found discrepancies, not criminal but sloppy bookkeeping and attention-seeking expenditures that had stretched the scholarship's mission toward marketing campaigns rather than student aid. Donors called for stricter oversight. The council instituted a review board and, by rule, invited former trustees to consult. Members turned to me. It was mechanical. It was inevitable. She had built her platform on borrowed structures and loud proclamations. I reclaimed those structures by the sober language that governed them, the language she had mocked because it didn't sparkle in photos. When the Heritage Council announced a temporary freeze on new initiatives until the charter review concluded, and when the scholarships board voted to require unanimous approval of any public rebranding, her initiatives stalled one by one. She was no longer the public face of progress but the applicant, waiting, uncertain, answering forms, emails, and requests she could neither charm nor pivot around. The last, most tender phase was the familial. Social doubt could isolate her. Institutional checks could bind her. But to break her hold completely, I had to reclaim the heart of the household, the man she had wed and the grandson who would be the future's promise. I did not plan a dramatic confrontation. That is the theater of the young. I wrote letters. Short, careful notes left in places he would find them, tucked into the pocket of a coat he would wear to work, slid under his morning paper. No accusations, only memory. Do you remember the canoe trip when you were 12 and how you insisted we stop for blackberries? I still have your father's old tie. He would have wanted someone to wear it to the awards night. Each note was a thread, knitting him back to an earlier map of his life I knew by heart. I reminded him of stories he'd forgotten. The funny, the tender, the private. When he came to see me that first time after the letters began, his face was shrouded with the responsibility of a man who believed he was between two sons. He sat down, not in accusation but in confusion. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low, "about how things have been different." "Different can be good," I offered. "Different can also mean losing pieces of ourselves we didn't know we had." He faltered, and then, for the first time in months, he asked questions without her presence to preface them. I answered not with recrimination but with story. I reminded him of how his father had wanted the scholarship to be about access, not image. I reminded him of the late nights we spent balancing ledgers and writing thank you notes. I reminded him the reasons for certain clauses weren't vanity. They were protections for the children who would come after. It took time. It took patience. There were nights he left angry at me for playing politics, and other nights when he phoned at 2 a.m. asking about a margin in a report I had saved decades ago. I let those moments hang in the air like unfinished sentences, and I let him complete them slowly. The most delicate move was with my grandson. He was small, no older than 6, who loved dinosaur pajamas and the way my hands smelled of cinnamon when I baked him cookies. She was not cruel to him, but she used him. His face was sometimes a prop in her photographs. I began to spend afternoons with him when she had committee meetings, bringing paper crowns and forgetting schedules. I listened. I read his drawings. I learned the exact cadence of his laugh. I did not pit him against his mother. I simply reclaimed moments. Gradually, he sought the company that had been there all along. The hands that folded his school shirts. The voice that hummed the tune his father had once whistled. When she later tried to manufacture a public display of maternal devotion, the photographer found the child absent and the room full of the subtle warmth only a place that had been lived in could provide. People noticed. People remembered. They began to see the child less as an accessory to her armor and more as the bridge between us. My son's coolness thawed into something like gratitude, not complete but real. He began to come by more often, asking for help with a contract, seeking my opinion on a board matter, staying for long cups of late tea. Each return was a small, private victory. She grew frantic in ways that were new to her. The public invitations shrank. The approval forms piled up on her desk. And at home, conversations that had once flowed turned into transactions. She began leaving the house late at night and returning with the exasperation of someone who had lost the rhythm of a life she'd barely built. The final straw, and it was as gentle as it was absolute, came when a neighbor knocked on my door with a handkerchief in her hand and a photo that had been miscaptioned in the local paper. The caption credited my daughter-in-law with launching the summer literacy drive. The photograph was of my grandson reading under a tree, unfussed and genuine. The neighbor had corrected it online, noting the misattribution, and the correction had been shared and commented upon. People had begun defending not just me but truth. Her defense deteriorated from rhetoric into panic. She tried to stage a public announcement, a speech that would reassert her vision and claim of innovation. I did not attend. I did nothing loud. The room filled with polite applause, but when the questions came, the reporters, those honest, impatient ones who smell inconsistency like blood, asked about the auditing measures, the donor oversight, the minutes from the founding meeting. She fumbled. Her curated narrative needed a steady hand. The hand that was needed belonged to the past, to me, and that hand had not quietly gone away. By the time the son stood in the hallway one evening and said simply, "We need to talk," the knot had loosened. We spoke long and halting. He did not accuse. She had already accused herself in small ways. An exhausted tone at dinner, a defensiveness that leaked when away from public lights. When he asked whether I would stay engaged with the scholarship and the council, my answer was plain. I would, but not to reclaim glory. I would because the work mattered. He listened. He apologized, not in theatrics but in small, true ways. He came with a ledger one night, sitting cross-legged on my floor, helping me cross-check entries like we had done years before. We reconnected over the things that had always knit us together. The daughter-in-law, sensing the shift, tried to intervene. Her words were sharp and angry. He shut the door gently, not violently, and said, "This is between us." That small line, "This is between us," was my victory. It meant she was no longer the pivot of every family decision. It meant my son had begun to reclaim his autonomy. Ultimately, the architecture of her influence was fractured. Invitations dwindled, institutional momentum stalled, and the son began to return to the map he'd once known. She was still present, of course she was, but the center of gravity had shifted. Her loud proclamations now echoed in rooms that no longer rose to applaud. And in those quiet spaces she began for the first time to worry. I sat in the study one night, the house calm, the world outside muffled by rain. The ember that had once been a patient coal now glowed steady and bright. The work had been methodical and, by design, surgical. I had not humiliated her publicly. I had left the road open for her to reclaim herself honestly if she chose. But I had also secured the protections a legacy needs. There was still a final movement to come. A carefully staged closure that would ensure she could not rebuild on the same foundations. That would be the climax. A conclusive, undeniable moment where the last of her claims would be called into question and the family would hopefully settle into a steadier truth. It began with numbers. The daughter-in-law, loud as she was, never respected the quiet mathematics of security. She believed money was endless, that because it came freely it must flow forever. She had no idea that the very accounts she flaunted were arteries. Arteries I could pinch shut with a phone call. One morning, before dawn broke over the sea, I sat at my desk with a folder of papers spread wide. These were not fresh documents. They were years old, yellowed at the edges, but their signatures were mine. Accounts opened in my name. Properties registered to me alone. Trusts built carefully, long before she learned to sign her name with a flourish. I made the first call to my bank manager, an old friend who still remembered the champagne I had once poured at his daughter's wedding. "It's time," I told him. "Freeze the secondary cards. Access restricted." He didn't ask why. He knew. By afternoon, the daughter-in-law was at a boutique with her friends, arms heavy with dresses she would never pay for. When the clerk swiped her card, the machine hissed its first refusal. "Declined." She tried again, louder this time, demanding the clerk check twice. "Declined." I pictured her face, the color rising in her cheeks, the tremble of her hands when she realized it was not a mistake. The next blow came with the joint expenses. She had been siphoning funds slowly, delicately, with the care of a thief who thinks she's clever. Family accounts, household bills padded with extras, shared purchases that never reached the house. I hired an auditor, someone discreet, someone who worked for me, not the family. Within weeks, I had a full report. Every cent she had bled from me, every forged receipt, every business expense, that was nothing more than dinners with her gaggle of relatives. I took that report and filed it under a new account, one only I could see. Not yet revealed. Not yet weaponized. That would come later. For now, the bleeding stopped. I called my lawyer. Shut down every joint arrangement that can be dissolved. Quietly. Leave her name out of everything moving forward. By the time she reached for the grocery card, by the time she planned another weekend of indulgence, the account was gone. The beauty of it was not in the silence of her downfall. It was in the delay. I let her live days believing it was a mistake, that perhaps the system had failed, that maybe it was just a hiccup. Each time she called the bank, she was met with polite stone walls. Each time she asked my son, he brushed it off, confused but unconcerned. Only she knew the panic crawling up her spine. Me. I sat on my balcony sipping tea, watching the waves. Invisible. Calm. Dangerous. This was only the first cut. She sold herself like brand. Glossy interviews, staged photos, morning show smiles that needed no substance. People loved the spectacle. Quick statements, sharper hems, an accent of confidence that made them feel progressive without doing the hard work. The trick with spectacle is that it depends entirely on attention. Remove the audience and the performance dies. So I began with the audience. The first move was purely observational. I listened to how people reacted to her. Which neighbors deferred, which committee members changed the subject, which donors laughed a little too loudly to cover a memory. I noted allies, the ones she had cultivated and the ones who had simply liked the theater of her presence. My notes were not malicious, they were maps. Next, I used the old currency of social life, favors, history and memory. Where she had styled herself as the originator of projects, I quietly reintroduced the original threads. I brought up the real beginnings of programs in conversations that felt like nostalgia rather than accusation. At a garden club meeting, instead of denouncing her, I told a story about planting azaleas with 2 other women 30 years ago and how we'd scraped together seed money to start a small library for local kids. People smiled, and then one of them, a woman who had been at that planting, spoke up, adding detail and a name. The anecdote spread, embroidered by memory, and with it came the truth. The program's history had many authors, not one self-made heroine. I didn't attack her looks or her ambition. I undermined the idea that ambition alone equals authority. I asked questions at the right moments. Who signed the original mandate? When did the scholarship first begin accepting applications? Question here, a nudge there. They were not interruptions. They were gentle interruptions of the narrative she had constructed. When she tried to answer, I let others respond first. I let the room correct itself without my raising a single sharp voice. The second tactic was to expose vanity through context. She loved press. The more lenses, the more legitimate the image. I sent small, factual notes to journalists who had run feel-good pieces about her. Not anonymous attacks, proper civil correspondence. I enjoyed your article on last month's gala. You may be interested in the founding documents for the program mentioned. They outline a different path than the one described. The journalists who chase accuracy like sailors chase a lighthouse followed that thread. An editor asked for background. An editor who remembered my name from philanthropic lists called for clarification. A retraction here, a clarification there. The paper corrected an attribution. The online feature appended a note that the scholarship's origin involved earlier donors. Each correction was tiny, but reputation accumulates like snow. Small flakes first, then an avalanche when temperatures shift. I also sowed testaments among people whose voices mattered, those whose opinions had weight in the rooms she wanted to command. I invited a former colleague of mine for tea and casually asked whether she remembered the signature on a grant application. The colleague, slightly flattered and slightly guilty that she'd let someone else take credit, mentioned it in conversation the next afternoon at the council. A trustee corrected a social media post. A neighbor posted a scanned copy of an old program on a local community board that named the original committee members, my own name prominent among them. People began to remember. Memory is social. It spreads when others confirm it. But the most effective blows were delicate reversals of stagecraft. She scheduled a major talk at the cultural center, a speech that would have positioned her as the visionary for the next decade. I could have disrupted it with grand pronouncements. Instead, I undermined the scaffolding. I arranged for a former program coordinator, someone she had publicly snubbed months before, to be present in the front row. I quietly ensured that the coordinator had copies of the original reports and the minutes from the founding meetings. During the Q&A, when a reporter gently challenged the historical timeline she presented, the coordinator stood and produced the official minutes. The discrepancy was factual, not theatrical. It left the audience confused, not angry. Confusion is worse for a showman than outrage because it invites the rumor mill to fill in blanks. Another move was to restore intimacy where she had replaced it with spectacle. She took photographs with my grandson at charity events and posted polished captions. The child smiling, the mother glowing. I invited other parents and grandparents to small, undramatic gatherings where the child was simply a child. People began to comment on the photos from the charity page. Lovely to see him just being a kid. And those comments, innocent in tone, chipped away at the curated image that used family as a prop. Public relationships are built on perceived equivalence. Donors with donors, committees with committees. She had borrowed pedigree. I reclaimed it by quietly reviving old ties. I sent handwritten notes to long-dormant donors, reminding them of our shared afternoons and the hands that had filled the first envelopes. I didn't ask for money, I merely prepared the soil. The donors responded with recollections and small, returning gestures. A call, a lunch, a willingness to look at an audit. They had been asked to trust before. They recognized the voice that had once shepherded their confidence. Trust, once anchored, proved reluctant to shift. Meanwhile, I made my presence unavoidable without being seen most of the time. I hosted small salons in my drawing room. Not spectacles, but conversations. I invited the archivist, the former treasurer, a retired board member who kept the minutes in his head like sacred text. We talked about approaches to preserving programs, about how legacy and innovation must walk together. These were civil, earnest conversations. They were also publicized, modestly, through the community newsletter I'd helped found years back. The newsletter printed excerpts of the conversation, highlighting the values discussed and referencing specific founding goals. In quiet ways, the public record began to favor nuance over the quick headlines she depended on. Her reactions were precisely human. Flustered statements, defensive social media posts that tried too hard, an inkling of paranoia that made her repost her own achievements. Self-propelled noise that looked like effort but had no backing. Attention is expensive, she spent hers, and it began to show in the thinning praise. Perhaps the most exquisite moment came not when she faltered under the lights, but when she found no one left to applaud privately. Invitations to exclusive gatherings, the ones that conferred membership in the city's informal councils, slowed to an occasional RSVP that nobody followed up on. She tried to initiate a collaborative project with an old patron, only to find the patron lukewarm. When she hosted a brunch to reassert her vision, the guest list read like a set of polite obligations rather than true allies. She filled the room with cameras, but cameras only reflect what's placed in front of them. They cannot summon honest handshakes. Through all of this, I maintained one rule: never publicly shame. The world confuses cruelty with force. My objective wasn't humiliation for cruelty's sake. It was removal of power structures built on false narratives. I let the truth drip into prepared spaces and trusted that those who cared about stewardship would notice. Bit by bit, the social scaffolding that once propped her up loosened. Invitations thinned, endorsements quieted, her bold proclamations found fewer volunteers. The sheen was not stripped in a single dramatic act. It faded under the patient application of facts and memory. Where she'd once dazzled with a single laugh, people began to wonder privately what she had actually accomplished. By the time the council's charter review concluded, social momentum had shifted. Her speech on innovation felt like a late reply to a conversation that had already moved on. People listened politely, but their applause, once raucous, sounded measured, obligated. The daughter-in-law had been a comet that burned bright and fast. I had been the moon, slow and constant, and in the end gravity quieted her burn. Money gone. Reputation cracked. But the deepest victory would not come from ledgers or headlines. It would come from within my own walls, from the son I raised and the grandson she tried to weaponize. I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. I waited for him to come because eventually, exhaustion always leads men home. And he did. One evening, standing on my doorstep, shoulders heavy, his voice quieter than I remembered. "She said you turned him against her," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I let him inside, no drama, just tea. And then, without bitterness, I slid a single folder across the table. Bank statements, contracts, her signatures bold where mine had been erased. I didn't add commentary. I let the silence do the work. When he finally spoke, it was not anger but disbelief. "All this time. She loves being seen," I told him gently. "But love is not the same as loyalty." His silence stretched, but I saw the crack. The mask she had forced on him was slipping. With my grandson, the victory was simpler, purer. No speeches, no folders. Just mornings in my garden, bare feet on dew-wet grass, sticky fingers from stolen peaches. I gave him what she could never understand: space to be a child, not a prop. When he laughed freely in my house, I knew she was losing her tightest grip. This was not revenge delivered in public. This was the quietest form, the return of what she thought she owned. My family. She chose the gala to make her last stand. Of course she did. Pride hides in spectacles. She booked the cultural hall, hired the musicians, sent the glossy invites with her smiling face on the header. She would reclaim the narrative under chandeliers and microphones. She thought spectacle would seal it. I went because I always went. Not to watch her fall. That would be petty. But because the room belonged to the work and the work needed a steady hand in the crowd. I dressed simply, the way I always had. A dark dress, practical pearls, the jacket my husband used to tease me about. I arrived early and sat near the back where faces bent toward the stage and truth could move like a current under polite conversation. Halfway through her speech, when she was at her brightest, the cadence practiced, the anecdotes polished, a man in the second row raised his hand. He was one of the founding donors, a spare, steady man who had supported the scholarship for decades. He cleared his throat, and his question was not cruel, it was precise. "Mrs. Langford," he said, "could you clarify the allocation of funds in last year's report? There are notes from the audit committee I'd like the audience to see." A murmur ran through the room. Cameras leaned in. She smiled, the smile of someone who believed a smile could answer anything. Before she could answer, the council's secretary, an old acquaintance who had once taken my minutes, rose and crossed the floor. He carried a slim binder. He did not shout. He simply placed it on the lectern and opened to the page the donor had referenced. The room grew still enough to hear the musicians stop between notes. On the page were the audit's findings: misallocated promotional expenses, undocumented vendor payments, and a list of events that bore her name in the program but the founding signatures elsewhere. The language was dry, bureaucratic, the sort of thing you skim until it matters. Tonight it mattered. A reporter asked softly, "Is this why the council froze new initiatives last month?" The secretary nodded. The donor added, "We will need a vote." Her face changed the way polished silver dims. Quick, brittle. She reached for her prepared remarks, for the practiced pivot she'd used so many times, but the pivot landed on air. The committee asked procedural questions. They were answered with citations, minutes, dates, the tools of governance she never thought to learn. Then, as if choreographed by truth, my son stood. He didn't storm the stage or raise his voice. He walked up, folded the chair beside the lectern, and in a voice that trembled but stayed polite, he said, "I support the council's review. I want the work to stand on its merit, not my wife's press releases. I'll step back from deciding tonight and let the process run." The hall exhaled. It was not a dramatic denunciation. It was a small, private sort of severing, enough. Her composure cracked, and the composure that had been propped up by appearances shuffled like cards in a breeze. She tried once, a last attempt to reclaim the narrative with charm. A camera flashed and aide whispered in her ear. But the donors were already speaking in low clusters. Questions shifted from tone to detail. Details have teeth. Volunteers asked about application numbers, about how funds were dispersed. The moderator called for a vote on a temporary oversight board. Hands went up. When the motion passed, not with fury but with fiduciary caution, she rose, voice thin. She said something about misunderstanding and intention. The applause that followed was polite, the kind you give a performer. No one rose in defense. No one stormed the stage. Spectacle, unmoored from substance, diffuses quickly. Outside the hall, under the streetlights, breath cold in my chest, she pressed her palm to the glass and watched the room empty. He called my son. I watched him answer the phone in the doorway, then close it, his shoulders heavier. I did not gloat. There was no need. The work had been saved by rules and memory and a quiet insistence that what mattered was the children it served, not the person who wanted credit. That night, the daughter-in-law left the gala with her public platform diminished. The banks had already frozen a couple of accounts. The council had already postponed her appointments. And the son had already begun to untangle himself from a version of life she'd been scripting. Everything converged in one room under one roof. Procedure met pride, and the result was ordinary and absolute. The days after were cropped of drama and full of small, exacting work. Oversight committees formed. Donors asked questions with renewed rigor. The audit moved from summary to detail, and the council invited me to consult, not as a returned queen, but as someone who had long tended the garden. My son came around more often, not theatrical reconciliations but the slow return of a man who remembered how his father used to read maps and ledgers at midnight. He brought his grandson to Saturday mornings. Pancakes, sticky fingers, a plastic dinosaur army on the kitchen floor. The child slept at my house twice that week without fanfare. He woke with the kind of uncomplicated joy that no publicity can stage. She retreated into a smaller orbit. There was anger, yes. There was also a visible weariness that comes from breathing less of the oxygen you once took for granted. She posted less, smiled less at cameras, and for the first time, the work she loved required steady labor instead of staged announcements. If she chose to rebuild honestly, the door remained open. If she chose to pivot to something else entirely, that was her decision. I had no appetite for public ruin. I wanted the work intact and the family whole. At night I walked the garden path where the magnolias stood. The house was quieter, a different kind of companionable silence. I thought of the ledger lines I had smoothed, the minutes I had corrected, the small notes I'd written into my son's pockets. I thought of the way the grandson's laugh sounded when he discovered a beetle under a leaf. Revenge is a poor word for what I did. It implies heat where there was method, noise where there was care. What I practiced was protection. I preserved an inheritance that belonged not to a single person, but to a line of children who would, one day, need a foundation not built on spectacle. People sometimes imagine vengeance as something loud. A scene, a shout, a final, public humiliation. Mine was quieter and, I think, more complete. It unfolded in papers and phone calls, in old friends remembering, in small rituals returned to their proper place. It landed where it had to, not as spectacle but as consequence. I sit now on my balcony, the ocean breathing its slow, indifferent rhythm. The house feels like a house again. Chairs find their places, photographs return to frames, dinner conversations find their old grooves. My son visits more often. My grandson climbs into my lap and asks for another story. The daughter-in-law's name exists in rooms, but it no longer commands them. If anyone asks how justice was served, I tell them the same thing I told myself in my study the night I decided to act. That age is not invisibility, it is patience paired with knowledge. Quiet, precise, and inevitable. And as the moon lifts over the water, I allow myself one small satisfaction, that a life taken for granted learned again to be counted.